Great, thank you. All right. So thank you, everyone. I see folks are joining us. And so we are getting ready to get started. I'd like to wish everybody a good evening. My name is Dr. Kim Butler of the Department of Africana Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Together with my colleagues, Dr. Akisi Britton and Dr. Shanti Rosado, we are the research team behind the project Insurgent Intersections, Combating Global Anti-Blackness. On behalf of the entire team, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. Before we get started, I want to let you know that the live transcript feature is enabled for those of you who would like to use it. You'll also be able to post questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And the comments panel is also open for your feedback and some information that we're going to be sharing along the way. So you can feel free to jump into the chat right now to let us know where you're joining us from. It's wonderful to have everyone. So welcome to everyone. About the project, Insurgent Intersections is a multi-year project that examines the particular importance of Blackness for understanding the mechanisms of social injustice. Throughout the project, we are bringing in the voices of scholars, artists, and activists to explore these issues together, moving through a series of themes ranging from the deep roots of anti-Blackness to its multiple manifestations, and eventually the ultimate goal of healing. We're especially interested in the lessons gleaned from Black experience that chart a path towards solutions and equity. Last year, we focused on the roots of global anti-Blackness. You can learn more about that and the whole project on our website, and we're going to put a link in the chat to the website. This year, our theme looked at the mechanisms of anti-Blackness based on the concept that anti-Blackness morphs to adapt itself to new realities and new contexts. We began the year with a keynote in multiple voices titled More Than Segregation, the Mechanisms of Anti-Blackness, Global Anti-Blackness Today. Political scientist Nicole Alexander Floyd, historian Donna Murch, Dr. Dawn Mouzon of the Department of Sociology was not able to be with us, but she does work here on the emotional impact of anti-Blackness. And geographer Kevon Riney, all of them are colleagues here at Rutgers. They helped us explore the diverse ways that anti-Blackness is manifested in popular culture, the labor movement, climate change, and global economics, all of which opened up a lively conversation that you can view on our website and on our YouTube channel. Also in the fall, we partnered with the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies to host an evening with author Tanya Cateri Hernandez on her new research on anti-Blackness in the Latinx context. Throughout the year, we run a Works in Progress series where we support new scholarship. You can learn more about this year's scholars on our website with projects focusing on policing, gentrification, racial erasure in Argentina, and the racialization of sex testing in sports. Tonight, we are thrilled to have some amazing scholars, thinkers, and activists to help us take a look at the ways that anti-Blackness is operationalized today. Many people imagine anti-Blackness, in fact, they even define it by the ways it has showed up until relatively recently. And it's true, there's often a chilling continuity between then and now. But today, we are looking at the ways anti-Blackness can take different, often more subtle and insidious forms. At our own borders, we have, as well as, of course, borders around the world, where Black people people who are facing strikingly different conditions and treatment from others. And we've seen this obviously not only in the United States, but in the treatment of African students in Ukraine. Millions of dollars have gone into DEI while maintaining deeply ingrained racist structures and practices. Black people disproportionately live in proximity to toxic areas and where infrastructures are poorly maintained. We live disproportionately far from food that is fresh, nutritious, and affordable. Even our technology has an anti-Black bias, programmed to whiteness as normative. If a simple soap dispenser cannot equally detect dark skin, we can only imagine how the AI behind self-driving vehicles and more future tech might also render Black bodies invisible and marginalized. At airports, the volume and textures of Black hair renders it suspicious and subject to pat down. And the recent push to ban the teaching of Black history and the concept that racism goes beyond personal prejudices, that it is systematically embedded into all aspects of our society, is a new iteration of attempts to rewrite our history as mythology rather than grapple with all its complications and complexities. So we're going to jump into all of this tonight with an amazing group of thinkers, scholars, and activists. But before we get into the heart of the program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our partners and supporters who have made this project possible. We thank the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice and its director, Michelle Stevens, the Scarlet and Black Center and its director, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, and the Department of Africana Studies and our chair, Dr. Edward Ramsamy. All of you provided critical funding for this year's activities and have been our partners in making Insurgent Intersections a reality. We'd also like to thank the Black Latin America's X-Lab at the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Chair Zaire Flores. They were our partners in bringing Dr. Tanya Cateria Hernandez last fall. And we are especially grateful to our department administrator, Dara Miller, and our project manager, Jenny Jang, who has expertly managed all the multiple aspects of running this project with creativity, professionalism, grace, and good humor. Jenny, you know, as always, we could not have done this without you. And thank you, everybody who is here today, for taking time out of what is always a crazy busy time of year in academia. Thanks for being here to help us think about how we need to show up around the serious business of anti-Blackness, not to ameliorate it, but to eradicate it altogether by whatever means necessary. So thank you. And so without any further ado, let me turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Kesey Britton, who is going to introduce tonight's guest.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that introduction. And thank you, Shanti, for being our co-conspirators in this, as well as to all our panelists and those who have joined us today. I am happy to introduce our panelists who we've asked to speak briefly about their work, specifically in the context of how they confront and challenge anti-Blackness in their activism and or their scholarship. So we're going to begin with Janvieve Williams Comrie. Janvieve Williams Comrie is the founder and current executive director of Afro Resistance, an organization dedicated to educating and organizing for human rights, democracy, and racial justice throughout the Americas. Janvieve is a human rights strategist, trainer, and organizer with a deep commitment to assist in the building of powerful social movements for racial justice and human rights. She's internationally recognized for her work with African descendant communities and has worked for the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights Regional Office Central America, grassroots organizations, NGOs, and the United Nations. Her work has spanned the southern-based United States, Canada, Mexico, Nicaragua, Belize, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, and more. Janvieve's work around race and racism has been highlighted on international networks such as CNN en Español, Al Jazeera, Telesur, and BBC Radio, and as national media outlets such as The Nation, The Laura Flanders Show, and Color Lines Magazine. And with that, I cede the floor to Janvieve.
All right. First off, thank you so very much for organizing such important spaces and panels. We need more, right? So thank you so very much. How do we work around anti-Blackness? And I must say, you know, the term is modern and new, but the work is not. So I always lead with that. We have always been doing anti-racism work. We have always been doing liberation work. So this is not new to us. People that have been committed to this. We were having this conversation before the call started. I have always been occupying a body of a Black woman. I have always also been a woman from Latin America. I have always been a woman from Panama. So that in itself means that I have always been fighting for my rights. Being somebody from Panama and being Black in itself already positions me as somebody that is working against racism, because it is not easy, right? Being a migrant, and I use that word very intentionally because I have lived in different countries. And when you leave your country of origin, in this case Panama, and you migrate into whatever country, you are already othered, right? Not that you were not othered in the country that you already left, but when you leave, that means that you have to begin, right? And in that beginning, you're facing an anti that is now multiplied, right? So it's not only anti-Blackness, it's anti-othering, right? So you're already anti this other thing that is on top of being Black, right? So you're also facing beyond just Blackness, or you're also facing xenophobia on top of that. And I'm sure we'll get into that conversation a little bit after. So that's on the personal, right? So a lot of people focus on like this personal piece around like Blackness and anti-Blackness, right? But there's also this collective piece, which is also is not more important, but it is really important because this really impacts how we move in a society and how it really impacts us and our not just our future, but our present and how we enjoy or not enjoy life and our rights and our humanity and our dignity, our respect and how we just function, right? And the organization for resistance that I founded and that I lead is 20 years old, and it has been through many facets. It was called the Latin American and Caribbean Community Center. We shifted and we changed the name, very intentional, because a lot of non-Black people were getting really confused with us because of the name. So we were like, you know what, we have to be really intentional and call it Afro Resistance. Because the mission hasn't changed, right? We're still around racial justice, human rights, and democracy, not only throughout Latin America, it's in the Americas. So it also includes North America, it's North, Central, South, and all the Caribbean. And with that also comes language, right? There is a misconception and a myth that racial justice throughout the Americas is English and Spanish. But Brazil is the largest country in the Americas, so it has to include Portuguese. And then you have Haiti, right? And Haiti, we are who we are because of Haiti, and we have to be really clear about that. So it has to include Creole. We're also Indigenous people. So when people say, "Oh, do you work with the Indigenous community?" Of course we do. We work with the Garifuna people. Right? Because Garifuna people are Black people too. So of course we work with Garifuna people, right? So anti-Blackness is also thinking that Indigenous people are not Black, right? So we're always pushing people to really start reflecting on their anti-Black thoughts as well. So it's not only anti-Blackness with non-Black people, it's also anti-Blackness within us as well. And where does that stem with, right? So we're also, the work that I do is also pushing boundaries, right? And we have to reflect on that in ourselves, right? So where do I also contribute to anti-Blackness within myself, right? Because of course, we're all socialized to be anti-Black, right? So we also have to really reflect on that and grow. So it's also growing, transforming, and really centering our humanity as people, right? And that work, we center the work within Black people. So I'm all Black all day, Black, 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 right? So how do we liberate ourselves for ourselves? That is my North Star. Yes, holding governments accountable is also the work that we do, and that's a different type of work, but our liberation has to start with us, and I'm very clear about that. So the center of the work that we do is by, for Black people. That's our starting point. So I'll pause there until we continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Janvieve. Already, I want to talk, but I'm going to introduce our next panelists. We have Arielle King. Arielle V. King is an environmental educator, passionate about making environmentalism and law inclusive and accessible to all people. Arielle's work is focused on storytelling and amplifying the voices, work, and legacies of those traditionally overlooked in mainstream environmentalism. She has a background in environmental racism analysis, developing anti-racism policies for municipalities and school districts, political ecology, civil rights law, and centering community input in environmental governance. Arielle is the programming director at Black Girl Environmentalist and the season 1 host of The Joy Report, a podcast dedicated to sharing positive intersectional climate solutions. Okay, I can't. Sorry. Arielle has earned a BA in Environmental and Sustainability Studies, a master's in Environmental Law and Policy, and a Juris Doctor focused on environmental justice and civil rights law. And with that, I cede the floor.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to apologize in advance for how congested I sound right now. I'm feeling a bit under the weather, but we move on. So to answer the question of how I confront and challenge anti-Blackness in its many manifestations in my activism and work, I would say that just recognizing that mainstream environmentalism in the United States has primarily been a cis, white, male-centered space. My existence as a Black woman and as an environmental advocate in itself challenges that status quo. And all of my current work aims at educating and empowering individuals and organizations to get more involved in inclusive intersectional climate action while centering joy and radical imagination in activism. I'm an environmental justice advocate, passionate about using my background to move environmentally overburdened and politically overlooked communities toward the notion of self-determination. And I feel like so much of that is just creating opportunities to limit the barriers that exist through the legal system, through other systems, and just allowing education to be the guide to allow people to be more involved in decision-making processes instead of decisions just being made on our behalf. And as an advocate, I would say that my work is rooted in collective liberation and guided by foundational principles that were laid out by Black women scholars from Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectionality, Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism ideologies, the aunties of the Combahee River Collective who believed that our liberation as Black people, but specifically as Black women, are inextricably linked to and necessitate that of all people. Melanie Harris's teachings on eco-womanism, and so much more. As an environmental justice advocate with a legal background, I look at the ways that anti-Blackness continues to manifest in the legal system and prevent us from living full, thriving lives. We'll get more into that a little later. And as the director of programming at Black Girl Environmentalist, I am disrupting the false narrative that Black people don't care about the environment. BGE is an intergenerational community that is dedicated to empowering Black girls, women, and non-binary people across environmental disciplines with the goal of creating a more inclusive and representative climate movement that's truly made in the image of all of us. So, I mean, this is achieved by educational programming, online campaigns, and in-person meetups and events and activations curated for and by women, girls, and non-binary folks. We just had our most recent event in Northern Virginia this past weekend. It was a showcase of a short climate documentary called The Aunties, which is about two Black women who now occupy land in Maryland and tend to this land, and learned that this land just so happened to be where Harriet Tubman's family spent lots of time. And it is like deeply associated and connected to the Underground Railroad and just our history. And so it's a really beautiful documentary. And it was a really momentous intergenerational conversation with the aunties and the filmmakers. And we're hoping to do events like that throughout the US. We're also launching hubs in different cities across the US over the course of the next month and a half, with 9 cities currently, and we're on our way to expansion right now. So I guess for now, those are some of the ways that I am confronting and challenging and disrupting anti-Blackness. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for that, Arielle. We're now going to move to our colleague in Africana Studies, Dr. Naa Oyo Kwate. Dr. Kwate is Associate Professor in the Department of Human Ecology and Africana Studies. Prior to coming to Rutgers, Dr. Kwate was on the faculty of the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology from St. John's University and a BA in psychology from Carleton College. Dr. Kwate's research centers on social determinants of African American health. She's conducted research on racial identity, the effects of racism on health, and neighborhood resources inequalities in African American communities. Her work has been funded by the Department of Defense, Breast Cancer Research Program, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Kwate is the author of White Burgers, Black Cash, Fast Food from Black Exclusion to Exploitation, that is coming out this year. And with that, I cede the floor to my illustrious colleague.
Thank you, Akisi. That's a wonderful introduction. And the book is actually coming out Tuesday. Next week is the publication date. So that's exciting. Thank you. But yeah, so you've already done some of the setup for me. As you know, like you just heard in the introduction, my training is in clinical psychology. And so really that was one of the first places that I confronted anti-Blackness, just in terms of the scholarship and clinical psychology means, I was training to be a clinician to treat individual psychopathology. And psychology as a discipline, I mean, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in psychology overall, but in terms of the way clinical psychology works, fundamentally it's about thinking about individual pathology. And so it doesn't look at structure, it doesn't look at context. And so, that means that the inequities that African Americans face don't really play into how you're trained to treat people. And so what I experienced was when I was doing my clinical placements in different large New York City hospitals, where I was seeing a client population that was, first of all, they were children and adolescents and their families. But so the population was Black and brown residents of New York City. And even though I was there to treat mental illness, the burden of chronic illness was staggering, really was, whether the children or their caregivers. So then I became really, and it was clear that a lot of what was driving what I was seeing in the clinic was the social and material realities that people were dealing with, which again, clinical psychology is not really training you to address or to think about. So I became interested in really trying to understand how social position, how anti-Blackness, how neighborhood resources or that lack thereof were putting people at risk for poor health in the first place. And so I expanded really from more broadly from mental health to health overall. And so I ended up moving, to School of Public Health, and then beginning my research program there. And so, one way I like to describe what I do is to sort of, mostly I end up thinking about the determinants of the determinants. So a lot of health research tends to be very behaviorally focused. So, diet and smoking and drinking and these kind of things. And there's more attention of late, over the past however many 10 years or more, about looking more closely at structure. But so I'm really interested in how, so for example, the study that was funded from the Department of Defense, the Breast Cancer Research Program, alcohol intake is a risk factor for breast cancer. Well, for Black women, what's the risk of consuming alcohol? And so, fundamental cause theory in public health research looks at what puts people at risk of health risk. And so living in a Black neighborhood, outdoor alcohol advertising was something that stood out to me, that was a potential driver of alcohol consumption. So that was one of the first studies that I did, was looking at how these ads were not only, so there's a bunch of research already existing that showed those kind of ads were disproportionately located in Black neighborhoods. So, we looked at what was the impact on problem drinking, and found that there was a strong positive impact. And it was not only the case that the ads were so prevalent. This is in Harlem. Not only were they so prevalent, but the messaging was wildly anti-Black, like crazy. Just in terms of the reproduction of really pervasive stereotypes about Black people, really insulting Black people at the same time as they're trying to court their consumer dollars with some of the kinds of messages. And so that was one of the first areas that I was working in. And then I also looked at the distribution of fast food around New York City's 5 boroughs. Find again that % Black was the biggest predictor by far. It was all about following race. It wasn't about income or some of the other factors that people would think automatically that it might be. And so one way that I challenged or confronted or tried to disrupt anti-Blackness was in a study that was unusual for me. It's not typically the kind of thing I do, but where I created an outdoor ad campaign, sort of trying to turn outdoor advertising on its head, to use outdoor ad panels in bus shelters to run what I was calling a counter marketing campaign against racism. So it was called Racism Still Exists. And it ran in Bed-Stuy. It was an ad campaign that ran one ad per month for over 6 months. And it really just talked about the persistence of racism in the US across a bunch of different domains. The data suggested that it reduced psychological distress among the participants in our sample that were in the neighborhood. And then the book that's coming out next week is tracing how fast food moved from a posture of resolutely, exclusively whiteness to one that strongly racializes Black and being disproportionately Black in Black neighborhoods. And how did that come to pass? And then I had also published a short work that was called Burgers in Blackface, Anti-Black Restaurants Then and Now. That was 2019. And that was looking at restaurants that use explicitly racist branding, architecture, menus, like as foundational to the enterprise. So for example, there's a restaurant that still exists that's called Mammy's Cupboard. It's in Natchez, Mississippi. And the building is literally a huge mammy. And you walk into her skirts to enter the restaurant. It's wild. You can read Yelp reviews about it. But yeah, so those were some, they're quite different manifestations of anti-Blackness, or the disproportionate exposure to fast food versus these really crazy reproductions of racist tropes. So yeah, so that's some of the work I've been doing.
Thank you, Naa Oyo. And now we're going to move to our last panelist, a new colleague of ours here at Africana Studies, Dr. J.T. Roane. Dr. Roane is an assistant professor of geography and Africana Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. His research interests include Black geographies, Black ecologies, Black gender and sexuality studies, urban and rural geographies, African American and African diaspora history, and political ecology. He is the author of Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, that came out just last year with NYU Press. We will be linking to his book as well in the chat. His book explores how Black communities built a significant, if underappreciated, terrain of geographic struggle, shaping Philadelphia between the Great Migration and Black Power. For the 2022 and 2023 academic year, Dr. Roane is serving as a member at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, where he is working on a new project about the political ecology of fire and social incineration from 1980 to 1995 in Philadelphia. And with that, Dr. Roane.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the co-planners and to my other colleagues and collaborators in this space. If it's okay, I did not rehearse this, but I want to share a screen just very quickly. Okay, so I want to center some of the work that I've been doing that combines some of my, sort of organizing activist interests, particularly in relation to my home community in the Tidewater, Virginia, my borough, Essex County and Tappahannock, Virginia, and some bridging some of that to some of the intellectual and other kinds of research that I've been engaged in to try to open up issues around Black ecologies. And so Just Harvest is a kind of indigenous, particularly Rappahannock and Black-led organization on which I sort of serve as a board member that really is geared towards and centering food sovereignty, indigenous and Black-led food sovereignty in the context of Tidewater, Virginia. In that area, my home community is shaped by a dramatic conundrum. Like, we're surrounded by open fields that produce corn and other things that feed the sort of, particularly in that region, is sort of larger chicken-centered production that happens, spanning several states, but that include Virginia and fold my area in Virginia in through grain. We're surrounded by tree plantations. And this is original plantation Virginia, as I talk a little bit about, a little more about in a second. And yet, despite the fact that we're sprayed with petrochemicals, many folks continuing to use shallow wells, and there's no accountability around what any of those synthetic fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides or fungicides do to humans and the waterway. All of that, yet I think it's something like 40% of kids experience regular hunger events in my home community. So we're like surrounded by a sea of food, but like can't feed ourselves. And so Just Harvest has kind of emerged to just think about how do we build autonomous local food infrastructures. And I think for me, it really builds on insights. And Huey had his issues, but Huey Newton's 1970 or 1971 engagement through revolutionary intercommunalism with visions for how small-scale communities could resource themselves, shut down the kind of channels that fed globalization, what he presciently was understanding as a kind of technocratic globalization in that period, and reimagine how they belong to each other across larger scales of space. So in addition to this project, I've also been working at length with my colleague who is now at the University of California, Berkeley, Justin Hosby, around what we kind of call a Black Ecologies Initiative, in which I started when I was at ASU, and while he was at Emory, and we both sort of transitioned and moved the project, shamelessly plugging our upcoming event on April the 12th, that centers literary scholars in relation to these questions of Black ecologies. And I think we try to use Black ecologies as a means of opening up precisely to what some of my other colleagues have mentioned in this space, the reality that not only are Black communities like disproportionately around the diaspora suffering from environmental devastation and degradation, but also that Black communities possess the insights, epistemologies, ontologies, and other modes of and practical modes of collective well-being to actually think beyond and to think a future outside of oil and the kind of nastiness that emerges in the so-called racial capitalist scene, plantationist scene, or however we want to describe it. And I use my research to engage these things, and particularly I center what I call the kind of Black commons and plotting these practices that emerge from the context of slavery, in the interstices of plantations as a mode of of collective well-being and provision that that are not romantically somehow outside of the plantation ecology enclosure, but which renegotiated at its edges to create the possibilities for Black living. And I just want to share just some examples from my own research that center that in the past, and that are from my home community, and that I try to bring online through a kind of activist research into our everyday consciousness as we build around food justice. So just these cases from the 1760s in my home community of hog stealing. Let me just say, first of all, hogs ran feral in Virginia in this period. Outside observers were always commenting that hogs and cattle ran feral. So the idea that you're stealing a hog is like you're actually taking one that's probably wild in the woods, and they're violently punishing people for this. And of course, we get this archive gives you the violence, but what interests me here is the world that exists prior to that disruptive violence, like the fact that people are sharing in this kind of insurgent mode of collectivity, ensuring that each other eat. Just the ways here that people engage the waterways and the larger kind of ecologies for their provision, and the ways that, as James Smith notes, through the kind of tension between him crabbing with his friends at night and the labor discipline of the plantation, that those come to tension with each other in generative ways, even in that context. I'm going to skip. And I just want to say that, in my own home community, I've been recovering more recently 19th and early 20th century formulations of Black agricultural and aquacultural production, because it's clear to me, despite dismissive and derisive and anti-Black inscriptions archivally of these practices, that really the Black social worlds that exist, that those are actually what generate the sustainable practices in relation to larger ecology. I think that probably sounds hopelessly anthropomorphic in a moment where we're supposed to all be post-human. But I think if we center and ensure the well-being of Black communities, we're actually also talking about ecologies automatically. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much, and look forward to more conversation.
Thank you, JT, and thank you to our panelists. We are about to kick off our discussion, but before we do, we're excited that the kind of universalized or the unifying theme of this panel is the importance of place and space in our engagement and our disruption of anti-Blackness. So I'm really excited about the conversation that we're about to have and the questions that are about to be given. So I'm going to kick it to my co-conspirator, Dr. Shanti Rosado.
Excuse me 1 second. I'm going to jump in out of order. But JT, everybody wants the link for your event. So if you could just drop it in the chat, I really will appreciate that. And we'll also be able to share it on our website down the line. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
No worries. All right, so I want to thank our panelists once again for just the work that you're doing, right? Like, it's very clear from all of your short, comments that like you are invested in the work, right? Like you are doing the work. And so many of us kind of struggle to center that when everything around us is kind of pushing us to just be in the grind, right? And so I just want to thank you for that. So I want to kick us off with a question about the specificity of anti-Blackness. So one of the things that we noted when we were starting this project is that, in 2020, when all the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, folks were really focusing on anti-Blackness and police brutality. And then over time, as things kind of morphed into more like institutional solutions, we found that the conversation kind of became more about racial justice broadly, and we lost some of that specificity about anti-Blackness. So I want to ask you all, how does centering that specificity of anti-Blackness shift our broader understandings of social justice struggles? And why don't we start with Janvieve, and then you can kick it off to whoever you want. And you're muted, by the way, sorry.
I was taking a minute
Yeah.
to reflect how to shift in that specificity again. Um, so as somebody has always held that line around centering Blackness and centering anti-Blackness, that really that was a tough one, right? Because folks now everybody was jumping on the bandwagon, right? And as somebody from Latin America, right, that got really shifty, because now suddenly, and I say suddenly, very, very, I don't have to be careful, right, in using that, because I have always spoken like this. Suddenly, a lot of people that never had used the language from the Americas, right? I'm specifically speaking around non-Black Latinos, right, from the region, were now suddenly speaking as people of color, right? That now suddenly we're talking about race, right? Where before they were just neutral and raceless, but they were not white, right? So they were always like navigating this like la la la. And now suddenly they were clear that they were not white and in alliance with Black people. And I was like, no, wait a minute. let's slow down, right? Because you all have not been like this before. And now like this like sudden like holding hands with Black people, this is like, nah, I'm not buying it. And for folks like me, because they do exist, like it's not rare, right? I'm not a unicorn. Like people sometimes are like, oh my goodness. No, I'm not a unicorn. Folks like me, right? We're like, we have been saying this for many, many, many years, and folks have just not been listening, right? And now suddenly you're listening to people that don't look like us, and that is anti-Black. This exactly is the anti-Black part, right? Where people that look like us are now all into like Brazil and Cuba, and oh my goodness, there are Black people in Guatemala. Oh my goodness, they're getting. We have been educating people about this. We have been talking about the struggles that are going on in Colombia. We have been talking about the U.S. invasion in Barbados, in Grenada, in Panama, in all these different countries for many years. We have been talking about the plight of Black people. We have been talking about the United States training police units throughout Latin America with tax dollars and the impact that it's having. We have been saying this because it costs our lives, right? We have not been focused on, oh, like we're mixed race. Like that has not been a thing for us, right? But now, right, like you have like a lot of these folks that are Latinos that are non-Black talking about, Black Lives Matter and, translating the documents and all that kind of stuff, and being highlighted as people from Latin America when we are like, we've been here. And that in itself is the anti-Black piece, right? And it was very interesting that folks, were organizing like Latinos for Black Lives. And we were like, that makes no sense to us, right? Like, what does that even mean, Latinos for Black Lives, when we have been marching like all along as Black people from Latin America, right? And we don't have to distinguish ourselves as Latinos for Black Lives because we are Black lives. we are Black lives. And people in Latin America we have Black lives in Latin America, right? So we push back, like people like me push back on that. And it lands many times on deaf ears. And it's a struggle that we have to have with our comrades that are African American, and we have those struggles, and we have them sometimes in I'm not going to say in a hostile environment, but we have them in an environment where sometimes it can get a little bit like that, right? And at the end of the day, we're Black people that are fighting for the same for the same thing. Like, we're not on opposite sides. So I think it's like a navigation that we have to have. And at the end of the day, there has to be an understanding, and I feel that there is, right, that white supremacy reigns. And how do we dismantle that, right? There has been a job that has been done throughout the Americas, right, in disinformation and misinformation, and that is still impacting us. And we really have to do our job to really inform ourselves, unlearn what has been taught and ingrained in our education. And I'm not only talking about formal education, right? And really get accuracy in what is and what is not. And that is through listening to our stories and really learning about, like, what are the actual facts that are out there. And that's part of our job, and that is part of our responsibility as well as Black people from different worlds, right? And different facets. Like, I'm still learning about the impacts that we just because of migration from Africa, the continent, to Latin America. I still have to inform myself about the impacts that is having into Brazil up to today, because there is a large percentage now of African comrades that are coming from the continent and coming through Latin America. And that is deep. And the impacts that is having in the region in regards to anti-Blackness, because it's still alive and well and thriving, and that's a real thing, right? So what is happening to the Cameroonians and the Congolese and the Senegalese brothers and sisters that are undocumented and transiting throughout Brazil, throughout Chile, throughout Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and getting to the border of the United States and Mexico and being stuck there? What does that mean to the ecosystem, but also through, to the different governments and the policies that are very, very much anti-Black, but also through the relationships that it's having on Black people and non-Black people in the region? What does that mean to the people that sold us into slavery, right? Like, so what does that really mean to those relationships? I'm still learning and unlearning as I'm working through that. And that's a difficult thing to do, right? And it's a painful thing to do. And on top of that, I'm mothering children. And on top of that, I'm living in a country that I don't consider my own. And on top of that, I'm parenting parents as well, right? Or I'm supporting parenting parents. So it's a lot, but it's what we have inherited, and we have to do it with love, as painful as that is. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I'm also answering from a space of love tonight, I feel.
Yes, beautiful. Why don't we open up to whoever wants to answer the question and just kind of let it flow organically, whoever's feeling moved.
I can jump in. I think that just identifying anti-Blackness as a root cause for so much of the turmoil and exclusion in our world, it does make it easier to seek solutions and like imagine more inclusive worlds. Because our liberation is so deeply and intrinsically connected to that of so many other groups. because our marginalization is almost like the foundation of the marginalization of so many other groups, especially in the United States. Thinking about like shifts away from the centering and honoring Black lives does perpetuate anti-Blackness and co-ops our work in our agency, because we're most severely impacted by that. Thinking about like issues of distributive justice, even when it comes to like vaccines, for example. Think about how like unequal vaccine distribution was at the start of the pandemic, and that paralleled the like unequal distribution based on race that we saw during the AIDS epidemic, you know. And it's like very, very similar in the ways. It's like if we're not talking about those through lines, then we won't be able to make those connections, and that work will be perpetuated. You think about like just in the context of like climate change, for example, those who are most politically overlooked and most severely environmentally burdened are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change most immediately. It's like when you like scrape all those factors away, almost always that means Black people. And that's globally, right? And so it's like, what does it mean to not talk about race when you're like trying to address these problems? What does it mean to like not specifically call out anti-Blackness when you're trying to seek solutions? Because it's really all connected. And when you're thinking about like place-based racism, we're seeing so many examples of that, and they've just kind of transcended history. Think about redlining and the impacts of people not being able to live in certain areas, not being able to get credit in certain areas to be able to purchase homes. We think about the ways that zoning have like very intentionally allowed for mixed use, which is allowed for industrial waste to be like placed in people of color, but specifically Black communities. And then even like the first report in like in the late 1980s, the Toxic Waste and Race Report, that was like the first national study to prove that the correlation and proximity to like a person's location, race, and like hazardous and toxic waste, that study showed that race is the single most significant indicator of proximity. And that has not gone away since 1987 when it was first studied. So like when we take away, or when it's attempted to take away or not consider the role that anti-Blackness plays, then I think that we are just coming up short of real solutions and like reimagining a like more inclusive world that has our best interests in mind.
If I could, because I just, a lot of the things you were just saying, I think are some of the things that come to mind too about, for me, the importance of the specificity of centering anti-Blackness. And so both what you were just saying, and then also Janvieve's point about, getting accuracy. Like, I feel like if you don't center it when it's what's, the driving factor, when that's what's operating, and you don't name it as such or recognize it as such, like it just sends you in a direction where you're either not going to be able to create solutions, or the solutions are going to perpetuate the problem, or they're not, So for example, what you were just talking about with housing. So, if you think about like, a broader struggle for housing, which is a problem in this country in so many quarters in general. But if you think about like the Black-white wealth gap, so, housing being the primary means through which Americans build wealth, and so because black people are less likely to be homeowners in this country, right? 44% versus 75% of white counterparts. And so obviously that sets, and so to be clear, wealth is not income, wealth is assets, right? So you could, assets minus outstanding debt. So you could have a high income and have low or even negative wealth. So if you don't own a home, you're less likely to have wealth. But then also too, Black people, because anti-Blackness devalues spaces where Black people live, if you do own a house, that house has less value because it's in Black space. And worse, something that came up a lot last year was this thing where we saw, Black individuals, regardless of where the house is, but because you're Black and you own the house gets appraised as with lower value, right? So if you don't consider anti-Blackness in as the operating factor in how the housing market works, then and you trying to redress the wealth gap, then that sends you to like, trying to instill greater savings, proclivities to savings or something. Like, savings is not the problem. That's not what, or it sends you to like home ownership classes, or I don't know what, but you know what I'm saying? So it doesn't address what's really operating. So for me, I think, centering anti-Blackness is critical for accuracy and then action also.
If I could also follow up with that, the centering the piece, right, is really, really essential. And I say that because for us, right, we do a lot of what does anti-Blackness look like in the practice and not in the abstract, where a lot of, when we look at, for example, migration and anti-Blackness, a lot of times folks focus on that on the abstract, right? So like migration and anti-Blackness in the abstract, but it's like we always look at an arrows, right? So militarization, right? There is an arrow of tax dollars. United States has military bases in another country, and those other countries, the military bases are usually in Black land. That means that they're heavily polluted, right? There's nuclear waste in those communities, so the water is already polluted. Fish industry is there. There's mining industry that has already been allotted to international corporations, usually from Canada, from Europe, from the United States, through international conventions, right? That have nothing to do with the people that are there, so they're not benefiting from that. And like I said, that's Black land. The water that's there is outsourced to other parts of the country and also international, so there's already drought. There's food deserts then are created there because now there's no fish industry that the communities have benefited from historically. That drives migration. Point blank. They have to go to other countries. Other countries have racism. Why? Because we live in a racist society. They don't want Black people in their community. The people that are coming in are Black people. You have to treat them like crap. That's just what it is. So they keep on migrating further and further and further, more and more into poverty. And I haven't spoken about gender, right? We know that when people migrate, the people that face the harshest condition when we talk about sexual violence, it's Black women, right? So then when they come into these communities, and I say these communities, I live in the Bronx, I see it, I live it, and I work in it. A lot of the Black migrants end up in communities like the South Bronx, right? So it's a lived experience that people have. It's not an abstract. The denial of temporary protected status impacts disproportionately Black bodies, Black children, Black women. When we talk about these people that have electronic monitoring devices, is Black bodies that are parenting children. These children are also in schools, and they're known as undocumented children. They receive a specific treatment. When they receive a specific treatment, it's not the most positive one. We know that there's a deficit of Black teachers in communities that are economically marginalized. We already know that these teachers are not Black. They come with their own mentalities around Black people and Black migrants. So it's like a continual circle, it's a continual piece that just replicates itself and feeds off itself. And the feeding is anti-Blackness that just keeps on feeding it, right? So we have to tackle, right, that little monster, and that monster is anti-Blackness. And if we can't talk about it openly and we can't address it, then what are we doing?
Yeah, actually, you are speaking directly to something that we wanted to to highlight, because, you know, I mean, a lot of us have, the reason why we are focusing this whole year on the mechanisms, it's because, you know, there's that famous quote from Malcolm X about, you know, dealing with the wolf versus the fox. And what's happening now is that so many times, you know, these things that we are dealing with in life, we are not necessarily we don't have the language sometimes, we don't have the understanding that these things are in fact expressions of anti-Blackness. I think this is what a lot of you all are bringing out, and what is really helpful for us, because we want people to be able to understand that is in fact what it is. And often, and you know, I want to make sure JT has a chance to weigh in on this. This is something that is couched in being other kinds of issues. No, y'all are seeing race. This is not a racial issue. This is an environmental issue. This is a human issue. This is, you know, all these other ways in which things are presented to us, and we want to be able to be equipped with the language to stand back and call it for what it really is and what it's really doing in Black people's lives. And so, you know, that was actually one of the questions we wanted to raise. We also want to make sure JT gets in on this, because one of the things that we wanted to get to, and I know that you have a question too, Akisi, about just the ways in which a lot of this is contextualized in terms of space and place. So, you know, I'm gonna kick it to Akisi to bring that in. And by the way, everybody, we're welcoming your questions in the Q&A, which we're going to get to shortly.
Yeah, I wanted to, like I said, when I introduced you guys and we were building the panel, I noticed I was excited about the theme of space and place in all of your work. Part of my work looks at the impact of gentrification on African diasporic religious communities. So I'm really kind of interested in how folks are dealing with and centering and understanding the role of space and place in combating anti-Blackness, right? So Janvieve, you brought it up, you know, so eloquently when you talked about, you know, Black land, the military bases, and all of these different things. So I wanted to know, you know, kick it to JT to, and other people too as well, but I wanted to give JT a chance to speak as well. What do you think that role is of space and place?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think geography is an important, I'm trained as a historian, but geography provides such, through landscape analysis in particular, and landscape studies and that kind of analytic around place, it provides so much that just a straightforward temporal framework could not get you to, because I think place is a kind of archive of multiple episodes of harm and violence, and often kind of stabilized in the kind of function of infrastructures themselves. And so I think in that way, like anti-Blackness in place can create layers of injury and harm that if you only look at it through as the procession of the temporal, that you will miss, right? And I think that, you know, I think of Catherine McKittrick's work and others who think about, for example, the ways that the plantation inhabits the present, and it's through place, it's through the kind of social relations and geographies that ensnare us. And I wanted to say, just to the last question, how the specificity of anti-Blackness is so important. I think this is critical around the question of environment and ecologies. One, I think because the other kind of disorienting formulations that suggest suddenly that we're all in this together, like the Anthropocene and others, they flatten so much about the reality that of disproportionate harm that's already being experienced. But also they reroute the temporal framework to short circuit an understanding that reparations would be central to climate justice, that other modes of like redress, financial, material, moral, and other kinds of redress are required, because they place it solely on oil. But you like, no, like the first spikes in the geological record are indigenous genocides and enslavement. Like that's where you see the first moments. And I think that continues to go up even into the what you were saying about the placement of military stuff and all of that, like up through now, those kinds of anti-Black structures are not just like complementary to anti-Blackness, but they're driven by it, right? Again, like, and I think really centering anti-Blackness, for example, in the founding of what we call climate catastrophe, it gives us a different starting point, and it requires us to actually be more radical in terms of where we isolate the problem and where we uproot it from. Because if we start with just oil modernity and don't go with the colonization of the Caribbean and the unfolding of all of that, then we miss a future, because it posits that we can have another round of capitalist enclosure that'll be green, and that's the solution. And it's like that's the precipice of more violent dislocations of people, more in scare quotes, climate refugees, more violence, more murder, all of that. So I think that's the danger of not centering anti-Blackness.
Arielle, you were nodding emphatically, so I'm like, I want you to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of the things. One thing I keep thinking about is just this idea of like, after climate disasters, especially ones that are impacting Black communities, a question that is often asked is, why don't you leave? Why don't you just like escape from that place for safety, for shelter, for solace, for whatever? And instead of like really like identifying like why did these things happen to a place? I mean, one of the like clearest examples is Hurricane Katrina, right? And like so many people all over the world were just questioning why people just refuse to want to leave their homes. And it's like, this is community, this is history, this is where my family built space and just unity for generations. Why should I have to leave because the government didn't do their job? And like, I don't know, I think that's just like a really important part of like the just the way that anti-Blackness is manifests in like systems, and also just like environmental protection and like whatever like recovery looks like in a space. Because also there were issues regarding like who can actually receive aid following so many of these natural disasters. And so much of that is linked with, whether you have the official documents for title for the land. It's like, if this is wrapped up in your family for generations and generations, then you might not be able to like identify that chain of title. And so there are just so many barriers to people being able to maintain place following climate disaster and environmental catastrophe. So yeah, that's really what I was thinking about as the conversation was manifesting here as it relates to place and space.
Also, just to piggyback on that, the idea too, when you were saying about, people are always sort of put through the ringer about why don't they just leave us? The other question is to go where exactly? If we talk about in this country, where I don't. And then the other thing too is like, actually just on Katrina, Christina Sharp talks about in the wake about, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the woman's name, but a Black woman who, with her 2 children, was unsafe where she was at home, tried to actually leave to get assistance, ended up knocking on the door of some white man's, at his house, seeking shelter from the storm. He says later that he didn't see that it was a Black woman. He thought it was a big Black man, and so he ended up, and he felt unsafe. So he sat with his back against the door to prevent, some sort of onslaught, whatever he thought was coming. Anyway, the woman, I know one of her children died. I don't remember if she did, but she just left to drown. So just the idea though, of like, why don't you just leave and seek what? But it's as if, where is help coming from? So there's also that.
But even that conversation is very anti-Black, because it's like the privilege of that people can just pack up and leave, right? When a natural disaster, like I'm gonna want to see it through. I had to leave because of an invasion. I didn't want to leave. I was 15. Who wants to leave? Most people do not want to leave where they are. Right? And that's just a fact. Most people do not want to leave. So this whole concept of leaving and staying, belonging and not belonging, is also a very privileged conversation. And most people that initiate it don't leave. So let's also be clear.
Also, just on JT's point about, you know, if you thinking temporally versus spatially, that makes me also think of George Lipset's book, How Racism Takes Place, where he talks about, like, so the title is meant to say, you know, it's that it's on the one hand, how racism happens, like the temporal sense of how history, you know, the course of history, how racism is happening. But it's also to say that social relations are given their full force when they're enacted spatially, so that racism is taking place, like the place, you know, the way the force of racism is given its fullest expression through place. And so, yeah, I think that's another sort of important way to think about that.
Absolutely. And I think we are, I think what a lot of folks are bringing up with the importance of space is also just land, right? Like land rights, and how that's always been a precarious thing for Black people because they're not seen as Indigenous, right? They're not seen as having a legitimate claim to the land. They're, you know, to riff off of Willie Rice's work, Black people are seen as aspatial, right? As not having legitimate claims to land. So I think we wanted to perhaps go to some of the questions from the Q&A. I'll pass it off to Akisi.
Yes. So, okay. So our first question, thank you so much for the seminar, Dr. Roane. Could you say more about human-animal boundaries, post-humanism, and anti-Blackness that you mentioned?
Okay, I try to keep this brief. I think the turn to post-humanism within certain kind of environmental studies, I think, has radical potential in the hands of somebody like Zakiya Iman Jackson, who starts that genealogy with thinking about Blackness, anti-Blackness, flesh, and all of that. I think in uncareful hands, those kind of formulations flatten and they also obscure the kind of complex relationships between anti-Blackness and even the founding and forging of separation between human and non-human life. And I think part of what I would I think Black communities have expressed a whole and created whole sort of rich dialogues and intracommunal knowledge that has an intimacy with ecologies, plant life, animal life. Again, I think that part of the anti-Blackness that's bound up with our kind of ecological present is the demotion of all those formulations as associated in the US context with the plantation, but also, you know, just in general with the derision of African and African diasporic knowledge systems. So I think a generative kind of approach to that might center the problem of anti-Blackness and actually center Black folks as having generative knowledges within that, again, would start with Black people themselves rather than imposing a certain kind of post-structuralist and postmodern theory onto Black life and grafting it there. So I think that's what I would say for now. I could talk about this for days, but I'll stop there.
Okay, so the next question is from Jonathan Alexander. That's my student. To Naa Oyo Kwate, how does global anti-Blackness shape psychology and health systems in the United States?
Yes, that's a big question. I mean, you know, it's like, I mean, so psychology's, it's psychology. So first, okay, so like, for example, if you look at this classic book by Robert Guthrie. I assume you can still get it, but it's called Even the Rat Was White. And he's talking about how, you know, like how pervasive whiteness was in psychology, like even down to the lab rat, right, in the experiments. But he talks about, and so he talks about how racism and has sort of threaded through psychology's history. But like, if you think about, I mean, so many aspects of what psychology has done historically, whether like psychology in the 1800s being at the forefront of trying to define intelligence, and you know, of course, intelligence testing still exists today. It's the kind of, you know, intelligence testing is supposed to be a test of aptitude. That's the same kind of a conceptualization of potential that underlies the SAT and, you know, all those kinds of tests. Like, so the thinking just about the ways in which psychology as a discipline has tried to conceive of human potential in ways that have always, you know, made Blackness inferior. Those things are still with us today. I mean, like there are still people, scientific racism is not gone. I mean, it's not, you know, it took maybe a different shape in the 1800s, early 1900s and so on, but there's still people today who are publishing, and there's still outlets that will give them page space to publish about how, you know, intelligence is hereditary, or how, and how, you know, therefore Black people are hereditarily inferior and all that kind of stuff. Like that still exists, that's still with us. And the ways in which scientific racism has fundamentally been about denying Black people's humanity, unfortunately, psychology has been, you know, a leader in that. That it's been part of that. It's been part of the forefront of that kind of work. And I think, and then in psychiatry, which is that's a medical discipline, but you know, as clinical psychologists, we, and I don't practice. I'm pretty far from home now, but in terms of, you know, psychologists have to rely on the psychiatric taxonomies, like in the DSM and so on, to diagnose disorders, and the ways the ways we think about mental illness or how people experience them, the way the sort of mind-body dichotomies, the way, you know, if you feel depression at more physically, that's called somaticizing. You know, like there are ways of thinking of just the ways of thinking about what people experience are always make a white reference point. And so, yeah, so it's both, I think, past and present. And then in terms of health systems, I think a really great example of this actually is Jonathan Metzl's work. So he has a book that came out a few years ago. It's called Dying of Whiteness. And in it, he talks about how, so he interviews different folks in different parts of the country. And early in the book, he talks about interviewing some people in Tennessee. And at one point, he's talking to a white guy, middle-aged white guy, who was very ill with like liver disease or something. And so he was against Obamacare, and which Tennessee at the time had rejected the expansion of, right? So Metzl sort of asked, well, you know, so by denying Obamacare, that was denying himself, because he didn't have health insurance. So he's denying himself the care he actually needs that could save his life. So Metzl asked him, well, you know, so what's the meaning of this? And he's basically like, well, there's no way I would support Obamacare. Like, I don't want it going to, you know, the Mexicans and the welfare queens and the whatnot. Like, I'd rather die. Literally, I would rather die. And like that kind of anti-Blackness, that you would rather put your body on the line, as Metzl puts it, you know, for racial hierarchy. That means that's why other people can't also have access to healthcare. And the healthcare, the way we conceive of healthcare in this country is crazy anyway. But just to say, as it is constructed, you can't even have access to that because of the way anti-Blackness works. So.
Okay, we now have, of course, the Q&A is popping as we're coming up to the end. I'm going to get to one more question. Please forgive me if I don't say this right. Starcy Kamara. They say, thank you for all of your rich dialogue this evening. I'm drawn especially to Janvieve and JT's emphasis of anti-Blackness as a central factor of displacement. I'm curious if among the many mentioned nuances of migration, climate refugees, etc., you could share more regarding local houseless populations displaced by gentrification, the lack of mental health resources, healing, and mass layoffs, etc. So this is really a question that the entire panel could jump in on.
I'll just say very quickly, I think anti-Blackness forms the grammar globally of who is displaceable, what populations and sites are extractable, what places can be easily condemned. And I think that shared vulnerability, happens at the scale of like, especially when we see disaster capitalism and Katrina and those kinds of things, but also in the kind of day-to-day operations of how particularly financialized global real estate operate. I think built into that apparatus and into the markets and into the functions of those kinds of exchanges are the idea that there are dead geographies, that there are places where nothing is going on, all anti-Blackness. And I think, so I think gentrification is actually a symptom of the kind of larger ecological and social patterning that emerges really solidly from progressive and post-progressive sort of thinking about, again, which built directly out of slavery, about who is capital and who can accumulate capital, and those being two very different structural positions within a global economy.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in before.
Actually, am I allowed to ask JC to say something?
Yeah,
more?
let's do it real quick. Come on, we can do it. Yeah, come on.
No, because I was just thinking said about the dead geographies, because I wanted to hear more about the fire, the stuff you're doing with fire, because that just made me think about like the planned shrinkage in New York and how all the spaces in the South Bronx and in Harlem and other places where they cut fire service and stuff like that because it was planned. It was meant to be, like they were seen as sick neighborhoods or basically spaces where nothing's happening, and they just let them burn by reducing fire service. So I just was wondering more about what you were thinking around that.
Yeah, I've kind of truncated some of that work into a shorter essay, but I think there is so much resonance, particularly between Philly and New York. And I was trying to contextualize the 85 bombing, this direct, explicit attack on MOVE and the repression of MOVE as a symptom of the kind of larger incendiary politics of the 80s and the 90s, in particular in Philly. The 80s in Philly fiscally are similar to 1970s in New York, in the South Bronx and in New York. And so like the city gets a Black mayor, who inherits a city that's going off the rails financially. And I think when you take the actual literal, which this is just a thought exercise. I don't in any way mean to take away from the specificity of the bombing of MOVE. But if you take the dropping of C4 by police out of that scenario, the profile of deaths is not remarkable for that period in Philadelphia up to the present. I mean, multiple elders, multiple young people die pretty much on a weekly basis in the city of Philadelphia in the 1980s and early 1990s. And then if you add to that, in relation to the larger syndemic that includes AIDS deaths, automatic weapons, intravenous drug use and overdoses, all of these things, and then just like the weaponization of fire, literal fire that comes along with political revanchism, then you get this toxic stew where people are being displaced, people are being killed. And I think it's a kind of, to go with Ingalls, not to be inciting, drawing in some old dead white person to have this conversation, but social murder, like the reality that infrastructures and all of that in that the vulnerability of them are a form of murder, if not direct culpability between individuals for said murder. And even as your work is pointing to, the cause of causes, right? I mean, distal public health mechanisms that cause even what we could just flatten as, well, gun violence or something like that, having a whole structural underpinning. So I think, we isolate the like urban issues of that period, the late 20th century into the early 21st century, from stuff like ecologies at our own peril. Like those are the same process, and we have to understand them as that. The idea that you can kill a forest that you can extract oil and destroy a whole neighborhood, or the idea that you could extract people from a neighborhood to create real estate value. Those are imbricating at the very least, those are interdependent systems, if not the same system. So thank you for that.
So we are coming up on, unfortunately, on 7 o'clock. So Dr. Butler, do I have your permission to close this out?
Well, it's a team. Come on, we're a collective. It is not about, there is no hierarchy like
I
that.
was like, help me though.
But she knows that I'm the Virgo that
She
always checking on the details. And the one thing I did want to say is we do have a couple of announcements before we close out. And I did want to let the panelists know that there are still a couple of questions up. And if you would like to, you can actually type in some responses to some of the questions that we didn't get to. So just wanted to invite people to do that. And I will humbly turn this over to my colleague, Shanti, to close us out.
All right. So first, I want to thank our amazing panelists for their contributions. I want you all to please visit the website for this event and the links in the chat to learn more about the panelists' work, right, and how you can follow and support that work. We also want to go ahead and thank again the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice for their ongoing support of our project. I also wanted to note there's a reason why we all have the same background photo, and that is because the coalition of Rutgers unions is pushing for a fair contract at Rutgers, and we may potentially strike soon. And so I would like to ask Jenny Jang to share more about the potential strike in the chat for you to follow. So we also want to encourage you to go visit our new page on how to get involved. Jenny's going to share a link to that too. And that includes information on organizations, scholars, and resources to help you better understand anti-Blackness and become accomplices in ending it. And while this event marks the end of programming for this year, this academic year, we invite you to join our mailing list to stay up to date. Next year, we're going to be building on this theme of the mechanisms of anti-Blackness by looking at the lived experiences of anti-Blackness. And so this is going to be centered on how Black people globally encounter and resist anti-Blackness. And as we've done for the past 2 years, we're going to be hosting a works in progress series. So look out for the call for papers for that. We would love to have you join us. And yeah, I just want to thank our panelists again. Thank you all for coming, all our attendees. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you for continuing to support this project. Thank you all and have a great evening.